make us whole. A phrase that's become synonymous with horror video games. Dead Space rocked the world when it came out in 2008, an instant hit that built upon the foundation set by Resident Evil 4, with its focus on over-the-shoulder third-person action horror gameplay. It brought forth its own innovations like more fluid movement, a seamless and diegetic UI, and a dismemberment system that broke away from the trope that encourages players to go for headshots. Instead, the most effective strategy against the gruesome necromorphs is to cut off their limbs. And this system goes hand in hand with the unconventional weapons you'll be using, most iconic of all being the plasma cutter, an engineering tool whose orientation can be switched between vertical and horizontal to effectively line up your shots against the contorted and deadly appendages of the Ascended. The Ishimura is one of the most atmospheric and iconic settings in horror video game history, making you jump at every bang and growl echoing through its corridors. It can't be overstated how excellent Dead Space is, truly one of the best horror games of our time. It went on to get an equally stellar sequel, a pretty crummy third entry, numerous spin-offs, and a breathtaking remake of the first game. Not to mention expanded media that fleshes out this fleshy universe with novels, animated movies, and comic books. Today, we're gonna explore a particular Dead Space game that's fallen victim to the dreaded fate many digital-only games often do of no longer being available for official purchasing. And for this cosmic nightmare, I asked the biggest Dead Space fan I know to join me in Ascension, Godzilla Mendoza. So grab your plasma cutter, strap on your rig, and let's see what lurks in the shadows of Dead Space Mobile. Before getting started, I want to announce that I've made a Patreon page for those looking to support the channel in an alternate way as opposed to a YouTube membership. You can get perks like early access to videos, your name in the credits, and shoutouts at the end of each video. Check out the link below or the card showing up now to find out more details. Any and all kinds of support are greatly appreciated. Now back to the video. Dead Space Mobile, also known as Dead Space Sabotage, was released on January 25th, 2011, alongside Dead Space 2, and was available on a number of handheld devices like the iPhone, iPad, Android phones, and even the Sony Ericsson Xperia. You remember that one? It was Sony's attempt at blending a smartphone and the PSP into one device. That sounds sick, dude. I can't believe this thing failed. I would love one today. I assume that this Dead Space spin-off was developed by Gameloft since they were the goats of early 2010s mobile games with banger knockoffs like Shadow Guardian and a bunch of Spider-Man games, which I've made videos on and that you should absolutely check out after this one. But this one was actually developed by Firemonkey Studio, a subsidiary of EA that has an extensive list of mobile games and was considered one of the leading developers of the mobile platform, with notable titles like Mass Effect Infiltrator, Real Racing, and several Need for Speed games. The quality that Firemonkey Studios was praised for in the mobile games landscape shines through in Dead Space Mobile. Despite being on far more limited hardware, the team went for an authentic Dead Space experience that makes smart decisions to make it a bit more suitable for a portable device while not compromising the vision. This game was actually originally meant to be a rail shooter, much like the other Dead Space spin-off for the Wii and PlayStation Move, Dead Space Extraction. You can easily envision that type of game working on a touchscreen device, as it would merely require the player to tap and swipe on enemies. But I think it's really cool and ambitious that Firemonkey said, fuck that, we're making a full-on Dead Space game that you can fit in your pocket. That and the fact that this game is not a rehash of a prior Dead Space game in the form of a demake or abridged retelling, but rather an extension of the universe with a unique story that gives us meaningful context of the events that lead into Dead Space 2. I think that makes this a must-play for hardcore fans of the series. Xavier will have more on the story later. For now, let's start up a new game and see how well the Dead Space experience translates into a mobile game. We start the campaign with a panning shot of the Sprawl, the floating city in space we'll be exploring. We also hear a bunch of radio transmissions of its residents as we draw closer to a figure overlooking the station through this big window. We take control of our player character known as Vandal, and I'm not gonna lie, he's looking a little blocky, kinda like a Roblox character. This is nothing I'd fret about though. If you've hung out with me long enough, you know that low poly graphics and stiff animations is what I'm all about. Just take a look at me. I'd be a hypocrite to make fun of this. This is the closest we'll get to PS1 aesthetics for the Dead Space franchise, well, at least official ones. This PS1 fan demake of DS1 is simply incredible. Either way, I'm all for it. I love the sharp edges and wonky running animation. I also really appreciate that even though the suit shares a very similar design to Isaac Clarke's, it is still recognizable as its own thing. The segmenting and armor plating has different patterns, and I feel like the helmet is a bit more square than Isaac's. But most notably, the color of this suit is more gray and the inner bodysuit is black, whereas Isaac's Dead Space 1 suit has more bronze and brown, and his Dead Space 2 armor has a bunch of different colored accents like blue, orange, and white. In terms of environmental aesthetics, there's an admirable attempt here at capturing that terrifying atmosphere found in the likes of the Ishimura, with the cold and harsh industrialist embrace of these corridors, often weathered with rust, oils, and general grime that clearly communicates that the Sprawl's purpose is more about productivity through all the different operations that go on here, rather than providing a comfortable and warm living environment that anyone would be happy to call home. Even though you're not getting dynamic lighting and hyper-realistic textures here, they did still capture the mood of the mainline games. Like the way shadows are casted by these fan units up on ceilings, but if you stare at them long enough, you'll notice that the light going through them is almost like a model itself. I don't know if this would be the right term, but it's like a physical acid rather than being a beam that's coming from an actual light source, like a tangible piece of glass. But the light does fade away as you approach them, which does help sell the effect. This is not a knock against the game. I think this is really smart and clever. They had to work with what they had available, and these graphical elements obviously can't reach the fidelity you'll see on a home console, and more importantly, they weren't meant to be examined and dissected like I'm kinda doing here. This game was meant to be played on handheld devices where these suggestions can be sold a lot more effectively due to the lower resolution and smaller screen you would be playing on. You know, they're more so meant to suggest the feeling you had while playing the home console version despite the obvious limitations, and I think they achieved that. Environments still have a commendable amount of detail with things like exposed wiring and tubing, posters giving workers that much needed morale boost, and countless pints of blood coming from all the corpses left behind. Our first task is to retrieve a plasma saw and take out some power boxes. I love that this game introduced the concept of a melee weapon that uses plasma technology. It's such a fan fiction feeling thing, like whenever people try to introduce a new lightsaber concept. But this totally works, and I'm surprised that this didn't carry over to any of the main numbered games or that it wasn't innovated on. But I also think it's kinda cool that it remains as an exclusive tool only found in this particular Dead Space game. To swing it, you'll have to swipe the top left corner of the screen, and even though I'm playing this on an emulator that allows me to play the game with a controller, I can see this feeling really intuitive on a touchscreen device. Shortly after disabling all the power boxes, we retrieve the iconic plasma cutter. I really like how this game handles weapon controls. It retains the minimal UI philosophy the franchise is known for. Your health bar is represented by that tube on your back, your ammo count can be seen on the weapon's built-in display, and using your stasis ability is done by tapping the very same stasis module on your back. And to keep the UI as clean as possible, to raise your weapon, all you have to do is tap the right side of the screen, rather than a dedicated aiming virtual button like most mobile games typically do. Once you have your weapon raised, just tap the right side of the screen again to fire. What I found really clever is how lowering your weapon works. Again, there are no virtual buttons on screen to do so, and if tapping the right side of the screen makes you fire, and the left side of the screen is still used to move around while aiming your weapon, well, how the hell do I lower it? Simple, you walk forward. This is really clever and intuitive. The game still allows you to strafe left and right to micro adjust your aim and walk backwards to move away from enemies. You will never really need to walk forward while simultaneously shooting to close the gap between you and any necromorph. Unless you got some big dick energy going on and want to jump headfirst into the bladed arms of a necromorph. So it makes so much sense to have pushing forward be the way you get out of aiming mode. Where we get into a tricky situation is when it comes to changing the orientation of the plasma cutter's laser sights, or using any of your weapon's alternate firing modes for that matter. To do so, you have to shake your phone. Like I said before, I'm playing this on an emulator, so I can't really do that. Well, thankfully, these emulators come with a virtual shake functionality, and you can even bind that to a key, which makes it even more convenient. I can't say the same about using the kinesis ability though. Objects I get able to grab with this ability will have a magnet icon over them, and to get a hold of them, you have to tap on said icon. Because these objects can vary in the position they are in relation to your view, I couldn't bind a key that would let me instantaneously grab them. You absolutely have to tap the particular spot they're in, which for me meant that I had to take my hand off the controller and click on the magnet icon with my mouse, which would simulate a screen tap. But even then, for some reason, it wasn't always responsive, and I had to click on these icons multiple times or reposition myself to have Vandal's body over the magnet icon. Because if I clicked a magnet icon while it was on the right side of the screen, the game would think that I'm trying to raise my weapon. This would also happen to me when trying to open doors or interact with terminals. To open a door or activate a terminal, you're supposed to tap the prompt that's physically on them. And again, if the door or terminal is even slightly on the right side of your screen, Vandal would raise his weapon. So yeah, sometimes keeping this game's minimal UI and lacking a dedicated aim button did cause me to run into some issues. But I still think it's admirable that they managed to keep that aspect of the franchise consistent here. I just didn't use the kinesis ability as much as I would have, and thankfully it's not that crucial of an ability, apart from some puzzles that require you to slot in some power components to open locked doors. But those were usually out of combat scenarios, so I wasn't pressed while fiddling with controls a bit. So after we take out some more power boxes using our newly acquired plasma cutter, shit hits the fan. Necromorphs start coming out of the walls, floor, and ceiling, sending the station to full-on red alert. I love how this early sequence mirrors the one from the first Dead Space game, and even Dead Space 2, where you're meant to just run for your life as an overwhelming amount of necromorphs come pouring out, and you don't have any means of fighting because you're unequipped, strapped in a straitjacket, or simply just caught off guard. You can actually fight back here, but I think most players' instinct would be to just run since it's just so out of nowhere, and you're also encouraged to do so by the voice in your comms. Again, Xavier will get into exactly what happened here in our story breakdown, but I'd just like to say that I really dug this scripted sequence and how the stakes were instantly raised in a way that really got its hooks in me. From here on out, you'll be exploring the rest of the sprawl as you figure out how the hell to get out of this nightmare. Each chapter has you explore a different segment of the space city, and you'll get the occasional level that breaks away from the typical dark and rustic corridor type of environment. The second level is already vastly different from the last, with brightly lit rooms and pristine design that's contrasted by blood and viscera. Even though there's room for a bit of exploration with optional rooms containing resources, levels are a lot more streamlined than they are in the console games. Often in between levels, you'll travel to the next section of the sprawl by a tram, and while you're on your way, you'll be faced with waves of enemies, and I thought this was a nice way of transitioning to the next level. It felt like a buffer in between stages, and was also a nice way to rack up some resources like ammo and credits dropped by the necromorphs you put down. The navigator letting you know where you're supposed to go is also here, but I rarely ever use this since levels are pretty linear. The game also effectively communicates where you're supposed to go by having accessible doors emit a blue light, while inaccessible doors emit an orange light that's very easy to see from a distance, so you never have to waste your time running down a hallway only to be met with a locked door prompt. I actually didn't mind this game having more simplified level design. They had to design this game with the mentality that someone may be playing this on a bus ride home, during a lunch break, or in between classes. Having levels that don't ask the player for a ton of commitment is appropriate for this platform. And despite that, I would still say that the detail and length of these levels still effectively convey a faithful Dead Space experience. You'll explore dark caverns, activate terminals to open previously locked doors, and experience lockdowns that won't be lifted until every hostile organic entity has been disposed of. To speak on combat, it is another aspect that has been accurately adapted here. Necromorphs function the same way they do in all the other games. Cutting off their limbs remains the most effective strategy against them. Pairing that up with the stasis module to slow them down, giving you more time to line up your shots or deal with multiple enemies at once, is also a useful technique. Hit detection is something that I expected to be a little finicky in this game, since appropriate response from enemies depending where in the body you shoot them is an integral aspect, and obviously there's the limited tech. But it all functioned as it should. De-legging necromorphs and finishing them off by stomping on their stumpy torsos is a great pastime. If you disregard the instructions finger painted on the wall and pour ammo into their center mass, you'll waste more ammo than you otherwise would. The usual suspects are here, like the common slasher with its two-bladed appendages, the adorable lurker that's always looking for a cuddle,
Yeah, fuck that baby!
and other recognizable ones like the exploder with its massive orange glowing tumor-looking thing. These guys' yelping sounds always creep me out, but it is a good indicator that they may be right behind you and about to deliver one hell of a wallop. My favorite is the Pregnant. Who names these guys? They're like Kojima characters. These ones lurch around with a massive swollen belly, and if you shoot their torso, it'll burst out with a bunch of tiny little annoying buggers called swarmers, making things harder. The latter half of the game had some extensive combat scenarios that actually required me to lock in. A hefty amount of necromorphs just kept coming out, and I had to run around the rooms to create some distance between them. Something I took for granted in the console versions is the use of 3D audio. Dead Space Mobile encourages you to wear headphones, but that's more for immersion purposes and to get the most out of those jump scares. When it comes to using audio to pinpoint where enemies are coming from, that's not really a tactic here. Enemies will sound further away to at least let you know that you're not in immediate danger, but the lack of 3D audio often had me whipping my head around to find out exactly where that necromorph is. I might perhaps be asking a lot from a mobile game to include 3D audio, but it was something I couldn't help notice in just about every combat encounter. I was surprised to see that I actually found myself in a pickle after being reckless with ammunition and had to resort to only melee attacks for a bit. Though, to be fair, I don't think I was super resourceful with all the different ammo types that were given to me. Vando will find more weapons beyond the plasma cutter that you'll recognize from other Dead Space games, like the line gun and the Ripper, which both function the same way they do in their console counterparts. But there are also other weapons that are only found in this game, like the aforementioned plasma saw and the core extractor. The core extractor is a powerhouse. Its primary fire mode shoots out a diamond-shaped plasma beam that expands the further it travels, making it useful both up close and for groups of enemies at a distance. Its secondary fire mode shoots out a concentrated beam and changes the game's perspective into first person. That's super cool. But like I hinted at before, I didn't really make the most out of the weapons given to me and decided to mainly use the plasma cutter. You see, the shopping system is also here where you can purchase upgrades and ammo. But most tantalizing of all are the suit upgrades. Oh man, I know you love a good aesthetic suit upgrade. And as soon as I saw how pricey those upgrades are, well, I decided to sell all the ammo I found that wasn't for the plasma cutter. And to go along with that decision, I also decided to dedicate all the power nodes I found to upgrading my plasma cutter at the benches found by the shops. Probably not the most effective strategy, as like I said, I found myself between a rock and a hard place when I entered a combat encounter low on plasma energy and no ammo for any of my other weapons. But it was worth it. Look at how sweet this suit upgrade is. I love how it becomes more angular and blocky, giving off the sense that you're becoming sturdier and resistant to anything thrown your way. Something that I found bizarre was the removal of health pickups. Yeah, you don't have to worry about finding medkits or manually healing at all. Instead, you can regenerate health by avoiding enemies for a bit, like Uncharted or Call of Duty. At first, I found that this took away from the survival horror aspect that should be present in a game like this. Managing your resources and taking a second to mend your wounds after a hectic battle are some of my favorite aspects of horror games. But actually, this was another smart decision to make for a portable version of a Dead Space game. It just makes it that much more accessible, which I think is something developers have to constantly keep in mind when making these types of games for the platform that they're on. Streamline it to the point where it may not make for the most intense experience, but still manages to feel like it can stand alongside the main titles. The decision to remove health packs didn't make it feel like it cheapened the experience. On the contrary, it did favors for it and just made sense. Would it be cool to have a Dead Space mobile game that's pretty much one-to-one to a mainline console game? For sure. But I also appreciate Firemonkey Studios adhering to the mobile platform.
Holy shit!
I really wasn't expecting this game to provide much in the scares department, but there are some good gags here. You got necromorphs reaching out of vent shafts and pulling bodies into the abyss, accompanied with a sharp horror sound effect. You'll also be ambushed by necromorphs playing dead that'll jump out at you when you get near them. They got me pretty good, though the game did it a few times too many, to the point where it became less and less effective with each recycled trick. The game encourages you to play with headphones every time you boot it up, and much like you'd expect, it does help a ton in immersing you in the experience. A major element of what makes exploring environments like the Ishimura and the Sprawl so immersive is jumping at those unexpected metal bangs coming from the walls and ceiling, as well as the also intimidating screams and growls from the monsters you'll be facing. Seriously, when these guys are all up in your face roaring at the top of their lungs, it had me shaking in my rig. But without a doubt, the most effective scares I came across in Dead Space Mobile had to do with the numerous hallucination sequences. As any Dead Space fan knows, exposure to one of these markers, an obelisk that's essentially the means of creating necromorphs outbreaks through mind control, will have its victim experience hallucinations to carry out the marker's agenda or drive them mad until they surrender their body to it. Throughout the game, Vandal will freak out and experience different visions, like walking into a room littered with corpses, necromorphs that jump out at you and disappear just as they're about to attack you, or even have Vandal himself briefly turn into one of these abominations, allowing players to control a necromorph, and give them flashbacks to that multiplayer mode from Dead Space 2 that nobody remembers. But by far my favorite hallucinations were the ones that had a doppelganger suddenly appear out of the shadows. The first time this happened, it completely caught me off guard. I thought my game was invaded by another player like they do in the Dark Souls games. But then I realized that this other figure was mirroring my movements. So, as anyone would do, I approached the imposter and they suddenly turned into a necromorph. I should have seen that coming, but it actually made me flinch. These kinds of hallucinations happen numerous times during the story, and they ramp up in trippiness toward the end. Oh yeah, the zero gravity sections are here too, and... Uh-oh. Huh. Well, this is awkward. So, in order to jump around in the zero gravity rooms, you're supposed to shake your mobile device. Like I mentioned before, these emulators have the ability to simulate a shaking motion, but I guess the ones required for these zero G sections is a particular motion that this emulator's shake feature just isn't able to simulate. I tried everything I could within this emulator, changing the orientation of the device, using the shake function while simultaneously changing the orientation, shaking my monitor, everything. Nothing worked. Ugh, I really didn't want to do this, but it looks like I'm gonna have to download this game on an actual mobile device so I can shake it the way the game is asking me to do so, and continue my playthrough that way. Otherwise, I'm completely stuck here. I was skeptical about this game running properly on this device because older games tend to have compatibility issues with newer devices, but there's actually a version of Dead Space Mobile that has been modified to run on newer devices. And wow, I don't know if the footage is capturing this accurately, but I think this looks a lot better than the version I was playing on the emulator. Textures are sharper and Vandal's armor looks a lot shinier. I actually appreciated getting to play this on an actual mobile device. I've never had to do this for any of the games I've covered before, and I've always expressed that it must have been a major pain in the ass having to deal with touch controls back in the day when these games were available to download on the App Store. But honestly, this doesn't feel all that bad at all. Everything I said about the controls when I was using a controller through emulation still holds true. Controls are intuitively designed in a way that you're never doing awkward gestures or fumbling whatever it is you're trying to do. I still prefer using a controller, of course, but this game's touch controls aren't the major setback I expected them to be. I did run into some really egregious graphical issues though. I'd often get this horrendous glitch that destroyed my eyeballs. I would get these spikes of textureless shapes that would spaz out on my screen. It made the game unplayable and I had no way of fixing it. So unfortunately I had to power through it. I didn't want to subject you faithful viewers to frankly epilepsy-inducing visuals, so my good pal over at Long Play Express was kind enough to let me use footage from their Dead Space Mobile long play. So I utilized that for any parts that I needed to do so. Thanks again Long Play Express for the assist, and make sure to check out their channel as they have countless long plays of these kinds of games. The only boss in this game is the one we face in the final moments of the game, and I thought it was pretty damn cool. It has a gnarly design with its mess of teeth, imposing size, and massive mouth that reminds me of a Venus flytrap. You have to avoid its tentacle attacks and projectiles until it raises its chin and exposes these big glowing yellow weak spots you're supposed to shoot at. You also have to deal with necromorphs spawning in during the boss fight, because nothing can ever be easy. This is indeed the only proper boss fight in the game, and I wish there was one more, maybe in the halfway point of the game, though I can't complain too much because there's also the brute necromorph that's used pretty sparingly, so I guess I'd consider those like mini boss fights. Alright, now that we've reached the end of the game, I'm gonna pass it over to Xavier for the story breakdown.
In Dead Space Mobile, we see a different perspective of the Dead Space universe as a member of the Church of Unitology, as opposed to our usual protagonist Isaac Clarke, who is outspokenly critical and distrustful of Unitology. The playable character here is an anonymous engineer codenamed Vandal by the Church. It's a fitting nickname, as Vandal has been recently converted by Unitology and sent to sabotage and vandalize systems aboard the massive space station known as the Sprawl, which houses an entire fully functioning city. All Vandal knows is that the Church wants the station's communications tampered with before some impending act that'll change everything. It turns out, Vandal's being tricked into cutting off the Sprawl from the rest of the galaxy so everyone inside can be killed and transformed by the spacefaring plague called the Necromorphs. It's like a fungus that infects dead tissue and reanimates it under a single shared consciousness with the only purpose of killing anything it sees to make more dead tissue. The Unitologists are under the belief that this is a holy transformation, and being turned into a grotesque space zombie is like their version of getting into the pearly gates. It's all quite morbid, and certainly a biting social commentary on organized religion, probably specifically other blank etologies of the world. At first, Vandal follows orders and cripples the station's communications just in time for the necromorph infection to start spreading, but Vandal has what the rest of the Unitologists lack: common sense, a conscience, and a sense of honor. So it's up to Vandal to make up for opening the floodgates of the necromorph horde by trying to save the rest of the station. The main antagonist of Dead Space 2, Director Tideman, is the leader of the colony on the Sprawl with no ties to the church, but he's still an incompetent government stooge. Tideman sends Vandal on a new set of quests to stop the necromorphs from crossing over from the mining areas of the station to the civilian sector, and the race is on to prevent a catastrophe that you basically set in motion. Since this is a prequel set just shortly before Dead Space 2, it actually spoils that the character Dana Le Guin is a Unitologist villain if you were to play all of these in chronological order. She spends the first third of Dead Space 2 pretending to be Isaac's pal in order to try and kidnap him once they get to a safe meeting place in the city. I think the best way to enjoy the Dead Space universe for the first time is to play each main game first, then watch the animated movie attached to that game, and then whatever side games may be set around the events of the main story, then the comics and novels. You start at the top and work your way down. Wow, they really stopped giving a shit around Dead Space 3. Vandal's handler from the beginning of the game, a fellow Unitologist named Tyler Radikov, suggests that he can put things right, and he's also been fooled by the church. So Tyler and Vandal go on a quest to reestablish the quarantine and block the necromorphs from taking any more bodies.
Vandal, that door's part of the quarantine lock. You'll have to backtrack about 300 meters, take a right through the utility area, and then get over that mine shaft and... I'm just screwing with you. Try it now, it's open.
Hardcore Dead Space 1 fans will remember the Easter egg of the first letter of the chapter title spelling out a secret message that spoils the ending of the game. And this is actually the last game in the series to do that trick. He will betray. Tyler screws you over by opening all the public sector doors and leaves you for dead. Now Vandal's last-ditch effort to save the station is to stabilize the failing reactor core, which has been consumed by a massive necromorph biosludge, presumably made by hundreds of corpses. Ugh. Vandal saves the core and kills the super necromorph, but is injured in the process, and after 2 hours of playing the pronoun game, we learn that Vandal is a woman named Carrie Norton. You got Samist, son! The woke mob made you play as one of those vaginer people! Apparently she has no relation to the Dead Space 3 character Robert Norton, which seems like an odd oversight. I mean, I know it's a common name, but don't do that. Despite her good intentions and her best efforts to undo her mistake, Carrie Norton can't put the necromorph toothpaste back into the tube, and she's been duped not once, but twice in the same day by the Unitologists into damning the Sprawl to a Cronenbergian body horror mutation massacre. But at the very least, she's kept this station from exploding into space vapor so a few survivors can get away, and the real hero of this story can work his way backwards through the chaos to finally actually put an end to the onslaught. She'll never meet Isaac, but she set the stage for him to save the day in Dead Space 2, which is kinda cool. What's especially neat is that her final audio log she records as the game closes can be found in Dead Space 2 when playing as Isaac, as he gets back to the mining sector. Only this time her voice filter is turned off.
Audio log rate number 438642. These could be my last words. The monsters are loose. I couldn't stop them. And now the reactor core is overheating, which will destroy the entire Sprawl if I can't fix it. So I hope someone hears this. It means I did that much right, at least.
It's a really fun piece of world building and makes you really imagine that every stray audio log or text file were written by other characters who had their own entire story aboard this station, even if they ultimately died or failed. Isaac comes across dozens of stories like Carrie's on his journey, but this is a special case where we actually got to see this harrowing tale play out from beginning to end before becoming one of millions of casualties of the Unitologist Church and their life-devouring holy plague. It just reminds you, there's a lot of ghosts on the Sprawl.
I had high expectations for Dead Space Mobile, and the game fully delivered. If you're a hardcore fan of the franchise and have somehow never played it, I definitely recommend checking it out if you have an Android device that you can download the APK on, as it is very close to a console level experience. More importantly, it has a really cool in-between story premise that fleshes out the universe in a substantial and rewarding way. I'm curious to see if other spin-off mobile games like Mass Effect Infiltrator and Deus Ex The Fall are as good as this one. Let me know if those games are ones you'd be interested in me covering. Special thanks to Sam, Carlos, and the Minor Prophet for subscribing at the top tier. You guys are certified superheroes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.